All right, History 132, folks. I wanted to talk a little bit about Unit 6, mostly about Chapter 26, but I also wanted to talk a little bit about the rest of Chapter 25. What's happening is kind of important stuff. We're looking at the birth of dynamic conservatism. We're looking at the birth of the modern Republican Party. You know, we had a president, we had Truman, and Truman's going to take over the reins when Roosevelt dies. And they're very much the Democratic Party. And the problem is that Truman's going to come out, he's going to do a wonderful job, but he is not Roosevelt. He's not that dynamic president. And what's going to happen is he's going to get pulled into a few things. We are going to have this new alliance in Western Europe. We're going to have this whole United Nations thing. But also we know the Truman Doctrine is going to come up, and that's going to dedicate us to being the police force as far as the world is concerned. It also is going to be we are the anti-communist group of people along the way. So we're going to get pulled into a few different things. One of those few different things that's going to come up will be in the Security Council of the United Nations. What's going to happen is we're going to irritate Russia, and Russia is going to go ahead and boycott the council for a day. Well, it just so happens on the day they boycott the council, South Korea will come to the council. And they'll say, hey, we have been invaded. When Japan left Korea, they split it north and south. The Americans and the Russians took over the north, Americans took over the south. They divided the governments. North Korea is communist, South Korea is democratic, and now those nasty North Koreans have invaded us and we need help. Well, thanks to this trusty policy we now have, the Truman Doctrine, we're going to vote in the United Nations to go ahead and intercede on behalf. And because the Russians aren't there to say yet, because they're not there to say no and veto the policy, it means that the United Nations is going to send an international force into Korea. And we're going to create, well, depends on how you look at it. It's a Korean War, but it's actually not an official war. It's more of a what we call a police action. We're going to get involved in that. Something you have to realize is why we're involved in that officially. Unofficially, we're also involved in a place called Vietnam. We are helping via the CIA. We're helping the French try to maintain some kind of control over it. So there's a lot of things going on at this particular point, and it's really not a mystery that folks are real not happy with Truman. And so when you have somebody who is popular, you're going to have a gentleman by the name of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Yeah, the same Dwight D. Eisenhower that was a military commander, that was a military general, that was a hero in Europe. His party is going to convince him to go ahead and run. It's kind of interesting because they said, well, you know, Eisenhower, what would you do with this Korean War thing? And he's honest. He's going to say, you know what? I don't know what the situation there is, which is unusual for a politician to say. He says, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to fly down there and check it out. My first day of office, I'm going to go down there. I'm going to check it out and decide what it is we're going to do from a military standpoint. And he does that. I give him credit for action. But you have to realize this is part of our movement against communism, our fight against communism. Ike is, Eisenhower, Ike is unusual in the president. He is going to be what we call a hidden hand president. He's going to be that first president that really puts the CIA to use. He's going to be that first president that really puts the FBI to use. And he's not going to do it visibly. He is going to intercede in other countries using the CIA to help maneuver some things along the way. What you have to realize is that we are incredibly worried about communism. We're incredibly scared of communism. As a matter of fact, I want you to go back to thinking. We were talking about what was happening in Congress. We were talking about the gentleman who is standing up in front of Congress and talking about, listen, there are 105 card-carrying communists right here in our very country, right here in our government. And it's interesting, because he is going to start this panic, and that panic is going to be HUAC that we talked about. That panic is going to be on loyalty oaths. That panic is going to be the tracking down and convicting just by word of mouth with no evidence at all a variety of people. And McCarthy is hugely responsible for what's going on. There are show trials. There is just panic. There are people with their lives being ruined just through accusations. And so you have to remember that's a big background shot of what's happening otherwise. Now, there's a few other things happening. The book mentions the Federal Highway Act. It mentions the car culture. It mentions the middle class. And you have to realize that the country we had before World War II is not the country we have now. If you think about how many people you know, how many teenagers you know, because this is the introduction really of teenagers, folks. It's not that people didn't have the teens before, but here the issue is we have millions of Americans that come back from the war who need jobs, and we don't have this opportunity for teens really to have jobs, so they're going to get stuck in that middle. They're going to have the opportunity to grow up while the big people work. Well, we're going to have the introduction of rock and roll. We're going to have the introduction of this whole teenage idea of not quite grown-ups coming in. And it's the birth of a brand new middle culture along the way. So there's a lot of stuff happening that you have to think about. This is also the introduction of Elvis Presley. Most of you probably don't know who Elvis is, but most of you know what rock and roll is. And we can thank folks along the line for that introduction, because it's the birth of modern music. Yes, even if you listen to music, whether you want to listen to pop today, whether you want to listen to soul, it's going to come from the roots of the birth of this type of music at this particular time. So keep that in thought. Let's see, I mentioned a little bit about the birth of the baby boom. There's a couple of other major things I wanted to mention as well. One of the things that happens here that begins the birth is you see the Congress of Racial Equality. Folks, we're looking at a huge movement in civil rights that are happening at this particular point. We're going to begin to push here post-war, and it's really just going to blossom into a huge movement. You look at the birth of the Urban League. You look at really some huge action by Earl Warren, the Chief Justice, and the whole Supreme Court, because here we start to look at Brown versus the Board of Education. Brown is going to, on behalf of his daughter, sue the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. It says, hey, listen, we've been following this separate but equal doctrine. It's okay for people to have separate schools, to have separate drinking fountains, to have separate whatever else, as long as they're equal. But I got to tell you, I took my daughter to this black school, and this black school is not equal to the white school. The black school doesn't have the heat. It doesn't have a good roof. It doesn't have the books. It doesn't have the facilities. And so she feels lesser. She feels lesser, and her feeling lesser is not good. And what will happen is this will just blow the court up, because the court's going to say, you know what, lesser is not good, separate but equal. That's no longer the law of the land. So Brown v. Board of Education is a huge thing, because what it does is it forces integration of the school systems. Well, if you know anything about the South, they have a problem. Yeah, still have a problem when it comes to segregation, when it comes to race, when it comes to discrimination. And so this is going to blow that wide open. It's also the introduction of Rosa Parks. And most people nowadays are familiar with Rosa Parks. If you're not, well, then she is the person behind the Montgomery bus boycott. Yeah, I know the book talks about Martin Luther King too, but it's going to be Rosa Parks, because what most people don't realize about Rosa Parks is she's not just a maid. She's not just a woman. She is an activist. And there is a plan, and the plan is to take and challenge things in the court. We're already looking at the Urban League. We're looking at the NAACP. We're looking at a lot of actionary groups who say, listen, we have to fight the system. We have to fight the cultural norms. But in order to do that, we've got to fight the system from within the system. They want to go ahead and bring this to the court. And so Rosa Parks is going to be that actionary who says, you know what? I'm not going to move. I'm not going to deal with this. And she is going to trigger something that happens at this particular point in time. And so this whole idea is huge. This is going to be the birth of that movement. All right, go ahead and read a bit more about the civil rights movement, and we'll talk about a few other things, because there's some other stuff to catch up on. But for now, I'll cut you loose. Take care.